I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and allow me to welcome you to Being and Logos, an introduction to Middle-Platonism. This seminar hopes to explore the philosophical foundations, especially in metaphysics, at the heart of Western philosophy following the death of Plato and before the rise of Plotinus in Neo-Platonism. But really importantly, this seminar is an example, an experiment really, in crowd-funded university-level education. No paywalls, no subscriptions, no fees, just here's a class for free. And that's only really possible through the generous support of my Patreon. If you want to support this project, please consider taking a look down below at the links for my Patreon. But otherwise, I'm honored to welcome you to this course as we explore the fascinating philosophical developments at the very heart, at the very origin of Christianity, of Hermeticism, of Gnosticism, and the foundations of Western Esotericism. Welcome to Being and Logos. All right, everyone, welcome back to our ongoing now summer seminar, although this is the last week of July and it's already sort of already beginning to kind of get whatever fall fever, the desire for it to be fall. But today we turn to the school at Athens. And school, as Dylan reminds us, should be used here in a very loose sense of the term, in that we don't even really have a good idea about how the philosophers that come after Plutarch exactly relate to each other. And in fact, when we start to look at lists of how they occur, it's not even clear who is giving rise to who sometimes in the list. And a lot of what we have, unfortunately, doesn't survive. A lot of their works don't survive. And a good bit of what we're getting actually is coming from people like Eusebius, the church historian. So we learn a lot about these philosophers from people who aren't necessarily their friends, although I will say that Eusebius seems to have a soft spot for the philosopher Atticus, as we'll see in a bit. But the school at Athens, that as it develops, really is marked, I think, by at this time, sort of, and this, we're talking about the 2nd century here, is a pretty high degree of scholasticism. This is a period of time where the schools, the major schools, the Peripatetics, the Stoics, the Epicureans, and the Platonists are really engaging in what I sometimes would call identity politics. That really what they're interested in is identifying very strongly as a Platonist, or identifying very strongly as a Stoic. And then a lot of what they're doing is very internally, very scholastic work. This will be the time period, as we'll see, that will produce the major handbooks of things like Epictetus, right? Think about the discourses and the Enchiridion of Epictetus. That's the product of this period. It is a turning inward toward intra-school scholasticism, and then turning outward in very admittedly pretty caustic and pretty childlike polemics, to be honest, as we'll see. And this is a period where those kind of polemics are really ramping up, because this is also the time period, as we'll see, where some of these schools are actually getting some money for the first time. And when you get money, when you get some institutional support, you really strongly want to be right. And so it's everybody against everybody else. And this period, again, I hate to not give any philosophers their due, but this period is a period that is relatively unremarkable, to be honest. That is to say, it is not a period of great philosophical innovation. They keep the lights on, right? They're definitely keeping the lights on. We do have some major figures like Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus, but at least on the Stoic, on the Platonic side of things, many of these philosophers are primarily known for what they do in terms of attacking Aristotelianism. And so Aristotelianism becomes the real target of their venom. And in many ways, a lot of their attacks, I think, are pretty poorly worked out, and in some sense kind of cringy and embarrassing. But I kind of liken this period to the scholasticism of the 15th century, where long past are we the days of Duns Scotus and William of Ockham, and now it's sort of they're just on the logic grind. They're just grinding out the minor problems of scholasticism in the early 15th century. And I think that something similar is going on in this period in the 2nd century when it comes to Platonism. But we can sort of mark out 3 big schools that emerge in this period, as Dylan does. This is the school of the Athenians that comes in the aftermath of Plutarch, which we'll deal with, I think, today. The school that emerges under the leadership of a certain Gaius, who is quite mysterious to us, but clearly a very rigorous philosopher. And he would give rise to the folks that would ultimately generate some of the major handbooks of Platonism that we'll deal with next time. And of course, the stars in many ways of this seminar, and I think what everyone's racing to wanting to get to, is going to be the Neo-Pythagorean school, most represented, of course, by Numenius, whose philosophical impact has never really been totally appreciated, in my opinion, and his philosophical impact has been truly decisive. But this period of time is again marked by a high degree of synchronization, or syncretization. That is to say, there are sort of these poles of attraction where any given philosopher can sort of be located by how they lean in the direction of an academic position on something, a peripatetic position on something, a Stoic position on something, but of course never an Epicurean position on anything. The Epicureans, of course, are too cool for school. They're doing their own thing, and they don't really care about, they have no interest in polemicizing. I mean, why would you polemize if you're an Epicurean? You can sit around and have your good life with your friends and drink your wine. Getting in arguments seems like not worth the trouble. And so the Epicureans are not terribly interested in those kinds of polemics. But again, this period is really represented, I think, primarily by a turn towards scholasticism, a bit stale scholasticism, and a great deal of polemical work. It's also worth pointing out here that in 176, Marcus Aurelius, one of the few good Roman emperors, does further concretize the balkanization of philosophy that was going on in the 2nd century by basically setting up and endowing chairs in the various schools of philosophy. Now, just to be clear, this is a pretty impressive thing that Marcus Aurelius does, that as a Stoic himself, as a very self-identified Stoic, famously self-identified Stoic, he doesn't seem to be particularly dogmatic about the other schools. He endows a chair of some 10,000 drachmae, which is an enormous amount of money at the time, to all of the major schools of philosophy at the time, to the Platonists, to the Aristotelians, to the Stoics, and to the Epicureans. And he basically endows scholarch positions to these schools. And it's amazing that, again, as a Stoic, he doesn't have any particular beef with the Epicureans or with the Platonists and the Peripatetics, and he endows these chairs. And these originally were elected by a certain Herodes Atticus, who may be the Atticus that we'll talk about in just a bit, although it's not quite clear if that's him or if it's perhaps related to him. But these chairs function as basically anchors of philosophy in Athens during the 2nd century. Now, of course, with the fad that was the imperial Roman world, of course, when Marcus Aurelius dies and Commodus comes to power, who knows? I can't imagine Commodus had the least interest in maintaining the endowments that Marcus Aurelius maintained or developed. But it's not clear how this stuff functioned at all. We don't have a lot of data about how these chairs function, what the schools look like. In fact, the only glimpses we get into the schools of the time is that they're relatively meager. But at any rate, Marcus Aurelius does inject a great deal of cash, some 40,000 drachmae, into the philosophical scene. Of course, I wish I could get 10,000 drachmae to fund my work, but we're not dealing with the days of Marcus Aurelius here in the United States. But the original academy was still fallow. It was still a ruin. And it's not even clear that anyone took the time to rebuild. No one did. No one took the time to rebuild the academy. It wouldn't be rebuilt, I think, into the 5th century. But the actual academy laid fallow, and no one's referring to themselves as a member of the academy. They will refer to themselves as belonging to Plato, or belonging to the Stoa, or belonging to the school of Epicurus. So even the identity of being a member of the academy isn't very strong at this time. It's more like you are a partisan of Plato, or you're a partisan of the Porch, that is to say the Stoa. And so that seems to be the way that philosophy is primarily functioning here in the 2nd century. But as I said, what emerges primarily in this period is a great deal of polemical work, and of that polemical work, a lot of it is not terribly well-developed philosophy. And it's worth mentioning here again that syncretism is the rule of the day. That all the while the Platonists perhaps will be saying, down with the Stoics, we don't like Stoic ideas around fate, or we don't like Stoic ideas around providence, or what have you. All the while they'll be adopting and using Stoic language. So this is a place where, on the one hand, they kind of speak out of both sides of their mouth. That is to say, they're identifying as a Platonist, they're polemicizing against Aristotle, and all the while importing Aristotelian ideas or Stoic ideas into their philosophy.
So again, it's a bit performative, right? There's something a bit performative about all of this, and it can be a bit frustrating because again, they're on the one hand engaging in this very strong politics of identity. I am a Stoic and you are wrong because you are a Platonist, and all the while they're adopting each other's language constantly and reinventing their language and using it in different kinds of ways. Again, with the exception, of course, of the Epicureans. The Epicureans don't syncretize at all, right? They are more than happy to use their philosophical system, their philosophical language. They're happy to talk about the atomo kaikinon, the atoms and void. You do not see them talking about the logos or the soul or nous, and whether it's at one level of reality at all. They've settled very much during the days of Lucretius and Prior and Democritus. They've settled on their metaphysics and on their materialist worldview, and they are just like, man, they live in their best life over in the garden, and they're not nonplussed by this the wicked ways of the world in Athens. Our first philosopher of note, and many of these philosophers actually, we know some of them from an inscription found at Delphi that mentions them as various philosophers of the period. But our earlier inheritor of the position of Plutarch is a philosopher that was known as Nicostratus. And as I mentioned, he's primarily known for his polemical works, specifically him attacking Aristotle's categories. And as you'll remember, this was sort of a sport that was basically pioneered by Eudorus of Alexandria, where for whatever reason they felt the need to attack Aristotle's categories. And they attacked his categories either pedantically, that is to say, they attacked them along the various rigor or lack of rigor that was developed by Aristotle when he was explaining the categories, or they assume that the categories are metaphysical in character and they attack the way that Aristotle orders them. And we already talked last time about whether you think about sort of the category of quality or quantity. Which of those two categories, quality and quantity, which one should come ontologically prior to the other? And we've seen some philosophers reject the idea that quality or quantity should come first the way that it does in Aristotle, and rather they say that quality should come first, quality, then quantity. A position I think that Hegel actually makes as well when he does his categories many centuries later. But this is the kind of debates that they're going to be having about Aristotle's categories. Now, to be clear, it's not even clear that Aristotle cared about this. It's not clear that Aristotle ever meant for the categories to be anything other than kind of a working papers. And so it's not clear that those texts were meant to be doing all the heavy lifting that so many philosophers have assumed that they are meant to be doing, from people at this time period like Nicostratus all the way up to people like Immanuel Kant, who really take Aristotle to task for basically what he thinks of as just generating arbitrarily 10 different categories, where of course the divine Kant will transcendentally deduce them for us. But at any rate, this is the kind of stuff that they're going to be doing, and this is the kind of thing that Nicostratus cares about when he's primarily attacking Aristotle's categories. And what he's concerned about is, for instance, Aristotle will say things like, all propositions or most propositions are capable of being true and false. And Nicostratus is going to go, well, actually, right? He's the Reddit guy. Well, actually, there are propositions, there are verbal statements which are not capable of being true or false, like a question. Questions are not capable of being true or false. They're interrogatives, expletives, right? Like fire. That's not really a question of true or false. And so these are our jokes, right? Are jokes true or false? Three guys walk into a bar, the fourth one ducks. Is that true or false? So this is a place where the propositions aren't meant to take on truth values. Now, again, is this a place where Aristotle didn't get it? I don't know. I just think Aristotle did not care about these kind of very small problems that people like Nicostratus are going to deal with. But this is the kind of things that he's going to attack. Another question that very much sets him apart from the Stoics is whether or not future statements about the future have truth values or not. And as you can imagine, whether or not a future statement like it is going to rain tomorrow, if that's true, that it is going to rain tomorrow, that means in some sense that the future is already obtained. And therefore, we're talking about a very strict determinism. But if it's the case that we don't know whether the truth value of it is going to rain tomorrow is true or false, and therefore a statement that the future lack truth values, then we can say that they could be otherwise, and somehow a form of fate or determinism does not obtain. And what Nicostratus argues is that unlike the Stoics, who do hold that all propositions about the past, about the present, and about the future, all have truth values, even if we don't know them, Nicostratus will reject this and say, no, statements about the future do not have truth values. And this sets him very clearly in the realm of Platonism. Because as we've seen, one of the things that the Platonists are going to be very concerned about, and this is something that Christianity will inherit very strongly, is that the Platonists need it to be the case that that there is volunteerism, that you can be virtuous and you can choose to be virtuous, and you are not bound by fate to do X or Y. This, of course, is unlike the Stoics, who hold that things are in fact fated. And this, again, this alerts us to the fact that Nicostratus is on Team Plato as opposed to Team Stoa. Again, as much as, we can think of someone like Antiochus of Ascalon, of course, was on both teams, very clearly identifying himself as a Platonist, but all the while using Stoic logic and Stoic metaphysics. Further, Nicostratus does accept the transcendental realm of the forms, so he does accept the idea of the forms, and again, this very strongly puts him in the realm of Platonism. Now, this attack on Aristotle is very interesting because one of the things that you may have noticed in previous lectures, and one of the things that we will notice as we get, for instance, into the later period in Byzantium, is that there was a desire on this time period, both prior to this and after it, to harmonize Plato and Aristotle. We talk about the so-called greater and lesser harmonies. The lesser harmony being that Plato and Aristotle are in themselves respectively internally coherent philosophically, and then the greater harmony is that Plato and Aristotle themselves agree with each other. And this Byzantine idea that there were the greater and lesser harmonies does not exist at this time period. There is a very sharp line between Plato and Aristotle, and the Peripatetics and the Platonists do not seem eye to eye, which is very much more like our time period, right? This is a thing where we would say that Aristotle and Plato are very opposed. We read them as very opposed. But one of the things I would point out here is that is very historically contingent. If you were in the 8th century in Byzantium, you would be following the greater and lesser harmonies, and you would not see a difference between Aristotle and Plato. And again, I can just point out that this had huge ramifications on the receptance of both Aristotle and Plato in the Middle Ages, such that you can have a text like the Theology of Aristotle, which is just Plotinus, basically, and a little Proclus. And people in the Middle Ages read that and were completely unaware that that was not Aristotle. Now, they had other works of Aristotle, but there was a sense in which that you could read something like Plotinus and not realize that this was not Aristotle. In fact, I think it was Thomas Aquinas who was one of the first people to recognize this. So again, this is a place where our hermeneutics deeply inform how we read these texts, and something that should be shockingly obvious, that Plotinus is obviously not Aristotle, is not always obvious depending on the kind of hermeneutic that you pick up. But at any rate, at this time period, we see a strong juxtaposition between the two schools. Following Nicostratus, the school is inherited by a certain Calvinus Taurus of Beirut. So again, we have folks coming here from what is now the Middle East, and he also is mentioned in that decree found at Delphi, and seems to have flourished around 145. Although the exact dates about when these guys flourish is very much up for debate. Again, a lot of what we learn about Calvinus Taurus and Nicostratus and Atticus is actually coming from Eusebius, and Eusebius's memory is not always. It's about a century later, and his memory is not always the best. But most of what we know from Taurus, who is the head of some kind of Platonic school, is from his student Aulus Gellius. And again, you can hear all the names have switched over to Latin, right? We're very much in the imperial period. But he does seem to have actually run a school, which is to say, he does seem to have had some kind of institutional backing. Some of that money just prior to this would ultimately go on. He would get, maybe the school would have gotten some kind of this money from Marcus Aurelius a little bit later, but he does seem to be running a school, although it does seem to be relatively meager, as we'll see. And he does seem to be rigorously studying Plato. And this is interesting because he's reading texts like the Timaeus in what I would call an analytical form. He's not reading them as a likely story, but he is recomposing the Timaeus into a more strictly analytical form of philosophical discourse. So he's demythologizing the Timaeus and reading it very carefully. In fact, he says to his students, it's very important that you read Plato to get the arguments rather than read him for literature, right? Don't read Plato for literature, read him for the arguments. And for anyone who's ever taken modern philosophy, one of the real things of violence that we do to Plato is that we just go to Plato to mine out the arguments in classical sort of analytic philosophy style. And this is quite bad. I mean, Plato was a stylist who was writing for, the medium is the message, folks. And so he was very much writing in a certain kind of way to elicit a certain kind of effect on the reader. And by just mining out the arguments, we do a real damage to the Platonic corpus. That seems to have been going on as early as Calvinus Taurus in a much more straightforwardly analytical kind of reading of the text. We know that he also hosted symposia. Of course, everyone hosted symposia, but his symposia were in the style of Plato, which is to say they were actually there to do philosophical heavy lifting as opposed to just drinking, but I'm sure they did a bit of that as well. And so we know that some of the questions that he was posed was something like, does the sage become angry? And again, that's a very, if your Stoic ears should perk up, because the question of does a sage become angry, if the answer is no, you're in Stoicism territory. And if the answer is maybe, then you're not in Stoicism territory, because of course the sage does not become angry in Stoicism. He's also interested in questions like, when does a dying man die? That is to say, he's interested about the philosophy of the moment. We might call the philosophy of the event. When is something said to have happened? And so this is an interesting question about when do people die. I'll also mention just briefly that in analytic philosophy, at least about 10 years ago, the philosophy of death was all the rage. Exactly what dies, when death occurs, what is it that does the dying? This was a huge in vogue topic in analytic philosophy and the philosophy of death. I took a whole philosophy of death seminar in graduate school, and you can imagine it was just as cheery as you can think. But at any rate, this is a question that goes back to Taurus. And as I mentioned, his school was relatively meager. There's a famous story around the governor of Crete came to visit Taurus's school, and I think the governor of Crete brought his father with him, and he went to go visit this famous philosopher, and the philosopher only had one chair. And so he went into the philosopher's classroom, and there was just the one chair. So the question was, who was going to sit in the chair, whether it was the elder, whether it was the governor, and certainly not Taurus. And so the school was known for its relatively meager provisions, but we can't be sure about this, because this is a thing that philosophers always tried to do the weird flex on, was how poor they were. Goes back to the Cynic tradition of people like Diogenes living naked in a barrel. Everyone wanted to sort of like flex on how poor they were. They would only wear the one toga. And this goes also back to the traditions of around Socrates and his relatively ascetic life, right? He never change his toga even in the wintertime and stuff. So anyway, we don't know if this story is really accurate, but it does go to show that the actual institution that Taurus ran must have not been substantive. We know that he wrote polemics against the Stoics, because again, everyone's polemicizing at this time. He also wrote a work called On Corporeals and Incorporeals. And I know that sounds like a work of metaphysics, but it's probably actually a work of logic. You'll remember perhaps in Stoic logic, they talk about the lecta, the things said, as being corporeal. That is to say, even words are corporeal for the Stoics. And there was a big debate about whether or not propositions were corporeal or incorporeal. And probably this is, again, a work arguing for the incorporeality of propositions over and against the radical physicalism of the Stoics. And again, we also know that he wrote some commentaries on Plato, specifically on the Timaeus and the Gorgias. So again, a real philosopher. Again, I said this is a bit of a decadent time period in the history of philosophy here in Greece, but Taurus does seem to have been a real philosopher and does seem to have organized a school around him and did do all the heavy lifting of teaching Plato analytically, writing commentaries, and teaching students. So again, we can certainly say more than he just kept the lights on. And as to that question I mentioned a moment ago, does the wise man, does the sage get angry? He argued that the sage can get angry and remain a sage, but should moderate his anger in such a way as to bring his anger under control. And again, who does that sound like? It sounds like Aristotle, right? That anger itself isn't bad. It's when the pathos of anger becomes uncontrolled. That is when it controls us, and we have an excess of it, as opposed to a virtuous amount of righteous anger, righteous indignation, we might say. And then this way, Taurus seems to follow both Plato and Aristotle, especially Aristotle. So a couple of things about him. He does accept also the idea that that virtue is sufficient for happiness. So this is actually very Stoic of him, that virtue is sufficient for happiness, that virtue alone is good. But he does include the Stoic idea of the things preferred and the things dispreferred. And so again, we've already seen philosophers that say, yeah, you can have a life of eudaimonia, such that you're not beholden to the passions, but it would be better, right? You can have a flourishing life, or a supremely flourishing life, if you have both virtue and the external goods. And it seems like Taurus is somewhere in that camp, where he says, yes, it is better to have, you have to have virtue to be good, but you also should probably have the things preferred, and these would be things like the external goods. So again, Platonist, also a little bit crypto-Stoic, also a little bit Aristotelian. Unsurprisingly, Middle Platonism, right? This is the kind of thing that we should already expect by now. We do get a little bit of his metaphysics from some of the sections of his commentary on the Timaeus that come down to us. As I said, I think preserved primarily in works like Eusebius, and I think John Philoponus, who's most famous, of course, for some of the work he did around creation from nothing, ex nihilo. And really what Taurus is famous for is a pretty long extract where he says that a lot of the debates around this phrase gegenon, that the universe is gegenon, that it is created as it is in the Timaeus, actually come down to a very Aristotelian problem, is that the term gegenon, is created, is itself equivocal, that there are several different ways in which it is created can be used. And because they're equivocal, philosophically equivocal, this has led to confusion. And so what he does is he says, look, I'm going to create a typology of 4 different senses in which the word created is used, to show that people are actually engaging in this debate basically because they're just not defining their terms very well. And because Plato, when he wrote the Timaeus, for what he calls clarity of instruction, not philosophical rigor. Now, this is an interesting kind of argument, and we see the same kind of argument actually be made about Descartes centuries later, is that the meditations are not written in the order, the logical order, they're written in the instructive order. And therefore, it gives rise to things like the vicious Platonic or vicious Cartesian circle. What Taurus is arguing here is that something similar is actually happening with the Timaeus. Because the Timaeus is not written to be philosophically, logically instructive. It's actually meant to inspire religious awe. It's meant to inspire a kind of fidelity, a kind of faithfulness on the part of the philosopher, and not give them a logical order by which things happened. So his job is to show that the Timaeus actually is functioning much more like a religious text, and that we need to basically reorganize it if we're going to follow it philosophically in an analytical form. And so he gives his 4 definitions of what he takes to be gegenon, for something to be created. So the first sense is that it's not created strictly speaking, but rather it belongs to the genus of things created. So you can think about something being uncreated that doesn't exist yet, right? You can think about a Pegasus. Pegasus don't exist, but they could exist, and if they did exist, they would come to be in the same way that other things are created well. They would exist in the genus of, for instance, animals. And so it's not the Pegasus is uncreated, and yet if it were created, if it were to exist, it would be only sayable to exist as a kind of animal, and therefore it would belong to the genus of those kind of created things. So that's one way that we can say the cosmos is uncreated, but it belongs to the genus of created things. Now, there's a bit of a category error there, I think, but we don't have to get too much deep into it. But at any rate, that is the first sense. The second sense is that it's created in a theoretical sense, but not an actual sense. And the way that he gets to this is, we can sort of look at the universe and imagine it being, we can see that it has parts. and we can decompose the universe into its parts, and we can imagine a smallest part of the universe such that we can decompose it and imagine that it didn't exist at one point, and at some point it came to existence. And so while it is now composite, the idea is we can theoretically imagine it coming into existence, because we can sort of take apart its nature and imagine it as not existing. And therefore we can mentally do that. Therefore we can say it is created in the sense that it is composite while having never been composed. So that's another sense in which he thinks that people use the term created. Another sense is that it is always coming to be. This is the eternalist interpretation, that by being created, what we really mean is it's always coming into existence all the time. And therefore it's eternal, but it is in fact coming into existence. And in that sense, it can be said to be created. And finally, we can say that it is created in the sense that it answers the principle of sufficient reason, which is just another way of saying that everything has to have an answer to why it exists. Everything must answer to the principle of sufficient reason. Why is this here? And so far as anything has come into being, it must have a reason for having come into being. And the idea is that the universe is created. We say the universe is created simply to answer that criteria. And it seems to be the criteria 4, by the way, that Taurus interprets Plato, is that when Plato says the universe comes into being, what we're really just saying is that there must be a reason why this is here, and therefore we simply say it came into being to answer why is this here at all. Now that reasoning may be circular to you, but the principle of sufficient reason might be like that. So at any rate, this is the kind of typology that he's going to develop. And what's worth noting is that a lot of philosophers who come after Taurus will, in some sense, adopt his typology, and they'll run with it. They'll say, yes, I accept version 3, that the universe is always coming into being, and therefore we can say that it is created in that sense, a more Aristotelian answer. And so different philosophers are going to adopt different versions of Taurus's typology of the equivocal term coming into being. But at any rate, at least in physics, he rejects the ether of Aristotle, which is to say he does not accept Aristotle's idea that in the superlunar realm there is a different substance that exists there, the ethereal substance. He accepts that the universe is composed of the classic 4, the Empedoclean 4. And he has a curious idea about why the soul comes into being. This is a question that sort of that bedeviled a lot of philosophers for a while, is why the soul comes into being at all. Why is it here? And his answer is going to be an answer that's going to have huge ramifications on Neo-Platonism later on. The first answer that he gives is that the souls descend in order to do the work of finishing creation. That the demiurge started the process of creation, and that the souls are emergent from the realm of the demiurge, and they get stuck down here to bring the work of creation to some kind of perfection, to bring it to some kind of completion. And so therefore there is a theurgical element of why the souls come into being down here, that we are sort of the implements, the organon of the demiurge, and we are down here with a job to do. And that idea, by the way, is stuck in a major way, that people will say things like, you were put on the earth to do something. That there's a divine mandate, a vocation for every soul, and you're here to do a specific kind of thing in the interests of bringing creation to some kind of completion or perfection. That idea goes back to Taurus. So an idea that I think has had a lot of legs is to be found in this philosopher. But the other reason he gives for the soul is that the souls are extensions of the gods, and that the gods have descended into our realm in the form of souls, and they are ekphenextai. It is a revealing, and it is a manifestation of the gods in this realm, that our souls are actually a manifestation of the divine at this register of reality. And that language of ekphenein, that language of manifestation, of divine manifestation as our soul as an aspect of God, is going to have huge implications in Neoplatonism. And that idea that we are a spiritual spark of the divine, that we are a spark of the divine sort of shoved down here, and we are that the divine manifests itself as our soul, again, is a big idea in elements of Christianity, of Gnosticism. It will influence Judaism as well. But this idea of that you are a fragment of the divine revealing itself in the lower realm is a really big idea that's going to have do a lot of heavy lifting in Neoplatonism much later on. So yeah, again, this is sort of the idea that you're going to see later on in folks like Iamblichus and Proclus and even Plotinus. So again, the idea that the soul is a manifestation of the gods is a really big idea. We do know that again, as I mentioned, we do have a commentary of the Timaeus by Taurus. It's preserved in the works of John Philoponus, which, if you've ever want to read a really tedious book, you can read John Philoponus's book on his arguments for the non-eternality of the universe. Hugely influential book, but can be a bit turgid to read. But we do have some sections, some snippets of and you can see why John Philoponus is interested in Taurus, because Taurus is interested in the question of whether the universe is eternal or not. What does it mean to say the universe is created? But we do get a glimpse into Taurus's commentary on the Timaeus here, and I will say that it is relatively impressive in the sense that he's doing a line by line analysis of the Timaeus. He's emendating it. He's actually going through and linguistically and asking questions about whether the text is preserved properly. So he's engaging in some degree of what we might call textual criticism. He will emendate the text. He will actually amend the text when it needs to be amended, which tells us, by the way, that the manuscript transmission of texts like the Timaeus was not always terribly clean. And he rearranges the Timaeus to make analytical sense as opposed to making strictly mythological sense. So he's substantially elucidating out the meaning of the Timaeus as he is writing. And I will say that this kind of textual criticism this kind of commentary tradition is going to have a huge impact later on in Christianity. There's going to be the same kind of textual analysis that we see in folks like Taurus. The kind of commentary literature is going to have a massive impact on the way that Christians will, for instance, read the mythology of the Hebrew Bible and then mine out elements that they will need to build out their Christology. And of course, right, I don't have to remind you that Proclus is going to come on the scene a few centuries later, and Proclus really will be heavily influenced by the way that Taurus does his commentaries on the Timaeus. And a great deal of Proclus's commentaries on the works of Plato survive, and there would be simply no scholastic commentary tradition in the Platonic world without someone like Taurus really keeping that light on and doing it very rigorously. So at any rate, Taurus does strike us, I think, as a serious philosopher, scholastic without being overly fossilized in the world of Plato. But again, this is a period of time where scholasticism and polemics are reading the day, not innovation. Right? This is not the world of Plotinus yet. We're going to get radical innovation. This is a world where scholasticism really is driving the engine of philosophy. What seems to be his inheritor, Atticus. The Atticus seems to be the philosopher that perhaps is the guy that picks the chairs that are endowed by Marcus Aurelius, or he's another Atticus. It's a bit of a strange name for a Greek, for an Athenian. But at any rate, he was going to ultimately take up the chair after Taurus passes it to him. And it's not clear exactly how they relate to each other, but they seem to have been somewhat in the same school. And it does seem that Atticus was a student of Taurus. But he is perhaps the most vehemently anti-Aristotle. A great deal of what his work kind of comes down to us is basically him driving a very strong wedge between the philosophy of Plato, or what he takes to be the philosophy of Plato, and what he takes to be the philosophy of Aristotle. And he tells us famously that that ethics is to render us noble and good, to order our households in the best way possible. Again, you can hear the term oikiosis, right? Oikiosis, oikeon, oikos, like the economy, household. That's a very Stoic turn of phrase. And of course, to adorn the state with the best possible laws. I mean, again, they're in the imperial period. This is a period right around Marcus Aurelius, and so you would, it's not a bad time to be living in the Roman Empire, all things told. Physics, the task of physics is to to take us in the direction of the knowledge of the gods and first principles. So again, physics is, in many ways, we learn about physis, we learn about nature, because that points us in the direction of the gods, and that points us in the direction of first principles. And of course, logic is basically the referee in all this. So for Atticus, the order of priority when it comes to doing philosophy is ethics, physics, logic. And every philosopher has a slightly different order when it comes to those kinds of things: ethics, physics, then logic. Atticus, by the way, you're looking at this is the remains of the Stoa, by the way, here on the right. That is the end of the line of the Stoa that gave the Stoics their name. If you've ever been to Athens, the rebuilt Stoa there is not the Stoa that the actual old school Stoics hung out on. This is the remains of the Stoa. You can see one of the columns down here that would have been part of the colonnade, the so-called painted porch. At any rate, he does accept the Stoic position of the sufficiency of virtue for eudaimonia. So this way, Atticus is very stoicizing. And he attributes this position to Plato, actually. And there is some reason to attribute a position like this to Plato. Plato does sometimes say that virtue is sufficient for happiness. And he actually lambasts Aristotle on this precise topic, specifically because he thinks that Aristotle basically leaves, because Aristotle allows for the possibility of chance, tuke, he leaves virtue up for chance. He thinks that virtue is an accident, that you can sort of accidentally be virtuous. And this makes some sense. I mean, imagine being born into a privileged family. And if we take the argument made by Cephalus at the very beginning of the Republic, that it is easier to be virtuous if one is wealthy than if you're born into a wealthy family, then it's much easier for you to be wealthy. It's contingent upon something. And Atticus finds this to be reprehensible, the idea that virtue is contingent, can be accidental. You can accidentally be more virtuous. Atticus finds Aristotle's reasoning about this to be very poor. Further, he thinks that Aristotle's belief that that God, and again, we're thinking of metaphysics, mu and nu here, that lambda, that God basically is sort of this is a very deistic vision of Aristotle, where he imagines Aristotle's God as sort of knocking over the first thing, and the whole series of causation coming into motion, and therefore God sort of only acts once. And when Atticus reads this into Aristotle, he says, look, this is where God basically abdicates any responsibility for the world, and therefore not only abdicates responsibility, but is no longer engaged in pronoia. There's no providence for Aristotle. And because there's no providence for Aristotle, God's just absent. God's not actually around anymore, and God becomes sort of redundant. Now, of course, that's not true. Aristotle would claim that the final cause, the telos of the universe, is God is sort of driving that telos. The goal of the universe is to be godly. And so when you excel in ariteo, in excellence, you are striving to be godlike in your perfectibility. But at any rate, this is not the way that Atticus reads Aristotle. He reads him basically as a kind of deist, for whom there is no providence in Aristotle's sterile world. So this is a place where Atticus really thinks that Aristotle is impious. His philosophy is acebic. It is impious. But Atticus does the classic move of conflating providence, the world soul, nature, and the logos. So he does that classic Middle Platonic two-step, where all these Stoic and Platonic ideas all sort of get forged into one entity. And so this is seen as again, as sort of the demiurge and the world soul get forged into one thing. And those are all shoved down below a fully transcendental God. So we're back to the realm of Speusippus, where God is fully transcendent, and therefore there are no predicates that are true of God. And there is a secondary entity, the logos, or the world soul, that is responsible, that is the instrument, the organon, the instrument by which the world actually functions. So God is transcendent, and the logos, or the demiurge, is sort of the super that keeps the lights on and keeps all the things running in this world, that's actually responsible for generating and governing this world through pronoia. Although Atticus also seems to accept the idea of a kind of pre-creation, a kind of pre-matter. This is the maleficent world soul that creates a kind of chaotic realm for which logic and the logos has to impress itself onto that, into that pre-existent chaotic realm that Plutarch referred to as a phantasm and a wraith. So this is where Plutarch is clearly being taken up by Atticus in this this sort of the positing of a pre-created chaotic acosmic realm, which has all the appropriate Lovecraftian vibes, out of which, of course, the logos impresses itself, or logos impresses itself logic and reason onto that pre-existent matter, and ultimately gives rise to the universe as we know it. And also, again, this explains evil. Why is there evil? It's because the pre-existent chaotic matter cannot be fully tamed by the logos, and therefore there is some degree of evil lurking around at all times that we can fall victim to. One of the curious problems that seems to be bothering Atticus is a kind of long-standing problem in Platonism, and it's the relationship of what is called the paradigm to the demiurge. So as you'll remember, right, in the Timaeus, the demiurge looks to the paradigm, and when the demiurge looks to the paradigm, looks to the forms, he will take those forms and impose them onto matter in the process of generating the cosmos. But there's a kind of logical problem here. There's a kind of a chicken and the egg problem, and the chicken and the egg problem goes like this: does the paradigm contain the logos, or does the paradigm contain the demiurge? Which is to say, how does a demiurge be a demiurge? Doesn't there have to be a form of the demiurge for the demiurge to be a demiurge at all? And therefore, if the demiurge has a form, then the form of the demiurge must be prior to the demiurge. And therefore, the paradigm is ontologically prior to the demiurge. Then that gives rise to the natural question: where does the demiurge come from? And the second part of the second part of the paradox is that if the paradigm doesn't contain the demiurge, then how is it that the demiurge supervenes upon the paradigm? How is it that an entity that is not contained in the paradigm, how can an entity that does not have a form, how can it impose itself upon the realm of the forms? And this is kind of a Platonic version of something like Russell's paradox or something, perhaps. But this is just a long-standing question of what is the exact relationship of the demiurge to the paradigm. And Atticus argues that the demiurge is, in fact, ontologically prior to the paradigm. So we have God, we have the demiurge, we have the paradigm, we have the acosmic world, and then the demiurge will take from the crater, from the mixing bowl of the forms, and impose those forms on chaotic matter, and that is how the world is generated. And by the way, again, if you're for my folks who know something about Hermeticism, this should already be picking up. This sounds a lot like the Corpus Hermeticum, right? Where you have the mixing bowl and the generation of the world from the mixing bowl, the crater hermetis. And Plutarch, or rather I should say Atticus, is really actively worried about this problem, and that exact kind of language ends up in the Corpus Hermeticum. So again, the demiurge is promoted to a kind of god, certainly a godlike, a god being. But this causes a problem, and the problem now is if the demiurge gets sort of elevated to the position of a kind of transcendental god, if the forms are external to the demiurge, that seems to upset our natural idea, natural as much as it is, a very common Middle Platonic idea that the forms are thoughts in the mind of God. That's typically taken to be a solved problem by Middle Platonism. Middle Platonism's solution to the location of the forms is that the forms are thoughts in the mind of God, a la Philo. Well, the problem now is that if you strictly separate the paradigm, the forms, from the demiurge, and you throw the demiurge really high up the ontological ladder, now it seems like you've orphaned the forms. So where do the forms live? And you're going to get a lot of criticism from people like Syrianus and other kinds of folks, where they're going to really criticize people like Atticus for basically orphaning the forms, or maybe even putting the forms in the world of the sort of chaotic realm of the acosmic world. So this is, again, a problem that for many of us is not a real problem, but if you're a doctrinaire Platonist, this is a real problem because you just orphan the forms, and that is no bueno. You need to figure out how to get the forms and rescue the forms from this otherwise orphaned situation. So at any rate, this is a, again, classic problem in Platonism about the relationship of the demiurge and the paradigm, and this is Atticus's answer. And in many ways, this will somewhat be a solution that will be followed up by Plotinus, as we'll see in a bit. Now, this is by way of this, what I mean to say is that the demiurge becomes a kind of nous, right? The demiurge becomes a kind of externalized mind, an active principle which will order the passive principle of matter. Again, that should sound a bit Stoic, right? The logos is the active principle which organizes the pneumatic field, which is ultimately passive, and those kind of things. That relationship is typically Stoic. We have a version of it here operating in Platonism. Now, the problem that emerges in all of this is that, right, if you elevate the one, the nous, all the way up into the transcendental realm, how is it that it, again, crosses the void of the transcendent to the immanent and does the activity of working on the world? If nous becomes completely transcendent, then it can't reach down out of transcendence to operate on the world. And this is a problem that you see in Atticus, and it's a problem that Plotinus picks up on. And Plotinus very much is aware of this problem. What does Plotinus do? He puts nous as the first hypothesis, right? So the first hypothesis is nous, and therefore what he does is he says he divides God and nous, the one and nous. He keeps the one, a la Atticus, in a transcendental realm, a transcendent realm, and he kicks nous down just enough out of the transcendent realm that it can begin doing the work of organizing the universe. So again, this is just an important thing to note here about Plotinus, who, by the way, is only about a century out at this point. Plotinus is dealing with problems he's inheriting from previous philosophers. Sometimes we think of Plotinus as just starting from scratch. He's just Plotinus and he's just developing Neo-Platonism from scratch. That's not true at all. Plotinus is looking at the Platonic inheritance of people like Atticus, realizing their logical problems and then working to solve those logical problems. And this is a place where he's inherited a logical problem in Platonism from Atticus, and he's solving it by, again, generating his world of three hypostases. But again, where's the paradigm in all of this? This is all going to get to be a big mess, and you have philosophers like, again, Syrianus, who's a later Neoplatonist, and Plotinus, who all reading Atticus are all going to be complaining about the way that he solves these problems, and Plotinus is going to be generating his solution to this in his form of the emanations in response to this. He's not so much a dualist. Atticus is not so much a dualist the way that we've seen with some of the previous folks. Even Plutarch is a bit of a dualist compared to Atticus, who's a bit more on a monist train. He even accepts the idea that there's a kind of harmony between the active, or between the irrational and the irrational soul, which is to say the rational soul is the logisticon. It's the part of you that is sort of your executive functioning, and the irrational soul, your senses. In many ways, these were seen as sort of in fighting, that they were not compatible. Atticus seems to think that they are in fact compatible, that what we have is a kind of combination of the two, and these combination of the two are basically what what we need to, again, in the very classically Platonic world, the vision of the soul is that we are the charioteer, and we need to pilot our soul in the correct kind of ways, and we pilot it in those correct kind of ways, we can harmonize the rational and irrational elements of our soul. What's interesting is that, again, he takes the ontological status of the logos imposing, or the nous imposing itself upon the paradigm through the demiurge. This sort of imposition of the rational upon the irrational at the cosmological level is again played down here at the microcosmic level. So we have a macrocosm-microcosm relation where where our mind is also part of our mind is the imposition of our active rational mind imposing itself on our irrational senses. And in that way, we are a mirror of the cosmological principles that gave rise to the cosmos itself. So in the same way that the cosmos is generated, we are generated as entities as well. So at the psychological level, at the level of our mind or our soul is playing out the drama of the cosmological genesis of creation itself. So there's a kind of mirroring aspect there as well, kind of microcosm, microcosmic kind of thing that we typically associate with something like Hermeticism. But again, we can find it here in the philosophical world of someone like Atticus. But at any rate, we know that Atticus was well respected by Porphyry and in some of his colleagues. In fact, he refers to the commentary that Atticus wrote on the Timaeus as being, quote, most industrious, which is somehow makes him sound very British or something. I don't know. But at any rate, we know that Porphyry and the later Neoplatonists did appreciate Atticus and his commentary. So again, scholastic without being totally fossilizing the philosophy of Plato. All right, another philosopher that, again, seems to be a pupil of Atticus is a certain Harpocratian. Now, this is not to be confused with the Harpocrates associated with Gnosticism. This is a different Harpocratian. But we know that he is, we know a lot about him, but he says to have been in the entourage of a Caesar. We don't know which Caesar, but again, a philosopher who, again, is sort of hanging around high-value people like Caesar. We do know that he composed a commentary on Plato and a Platonic lexicon, and these kind of Platonic lexicons and handbooks of Platonism are very typical of this period. We will get to one that survives here shortly, and Alcinous, who we actually have a surviving handbook of Platonism, but we know a lot of people were composing lexicons and other kinds of various scholastic documents. Harpocratian seems to have been producing one of these as well. And again, Harpocratian seems to be a lot closer to the Neo-Pythagoreans. Specifically, he seems to have been a bit closer to Numenius, who we'll come to shortly. What's interesting is that he leans, like Plutarch, far more into the language of traditional Greek religion, positing that Zeus is the primal god, who he refers to as an archon. He refers to Zeus as an archon. In fact, he refers to all of the Olympian gods as theor archontes. And so the language of Zeus as an archon, as a ruler, which again is a term that comes primarily from political language, political philosophy, that language seems to be interesting because that is a language that's going to be adopted, of course, in Gnosticism. The planets are going to be described as archons, the sort of malevolent rulers of our physical realm, serving under the horrifying demiurge. And also, it's worth mentioning that in the Gospel of John, Satan is referred to as the archon of this world. And so the language of the gods as archons seems to have emerged, or at least we get it fully expressed in philosophical language here in Harpocratian. And so the language of the gods appearing in the philosophical lexicon here. Now, this is probably a case where religious language is making its way into philosophical language, but an important importation just the same. And again, along with the Neo-Pythagoreans, which I can remind you that Pythagoras was famously a vegetarian because he believed in reincarnation. It seems like Harpocratian also held that even ants and flies are immortal, that they have souls, and that their souls, perhaps that they will aspire to the sublunar realm after they die. But even ants and spiders, even like sort of insects are themselves ensouled creatures, and therefore we are not unique in that we are ensouled. They will also have some kind of spiritual existence in a post-mortem realm. So again, really extending the logic of Pythagoreanism over and against even animals, all the way to any form of life. And again, this is a foreshadowing in some ways Numenius, who will hold that there is an impsukos hexus, that anything that is alive has a kind of life principle that is keeping it animated. And that life principle, that hexus, this impsukos hexus, the process of having a sukos, that is true of anything that is alive. And therefore, for the Pythagoreans, the Neo-Pythagoreans, this is going to be a much broader idea of what is alive as opposed to just human beings with our souls and such. So the idea is that, I don't know, the idea that there are wasp souls in the sublunar realm bothers me. Mosquitoes have souls, and these are wretched creatures. But at any rate, the Pythagoreans really had the idea that everything alive, in some sense, had this life force, and this life force persisted the death of the individual creature. Harpocratian is also noted to be a bit dualistic. which is to say that evil actually comes into the soul from the outside. That rather the soul being a kind of tension, a tonos, between rational and irrational elements, like we have, for instance, in perhaps Plato with the thumotic element, the thumos, the spirited element of the soul needing to be tamed. Rather, the soul for Harpocratian and for many of the Neo-Pythagoreans, the soul is inherently pure, but it can become infected through external means. So the external world, the physical world, can infect the soul and cause us great spiritual harm. So in this way, the physical world is conceived by Harpocratian as being primarily malevolent. That the physical world is bad and it can influence our soul in negative ways. Again, think about Hermeticism, folks. Hermeticism, the idea the soul is good. It falls through the realm of the planets. It becomes infected by these daemones as it plummets through the realm of the planets. And part of what you have to do is exorcise your soul of these daimonic influences. That element, something like that element, is also to be found here in Harpocratian, or the idea that the soul is pure, but it can be affected by negative forces from the outside. So he's a bit more dualistic even than someone like Plutarch, right? Plutarch was not quite this dualistic, but we're already seeing in someone like Harpocratian the idea that the physical world is bad. And so we're getting that kind of Gnostic vibes coming in through Harpocratian as well. So again, he's on the philosophical side of dualism, whereas we might say that Gnosticism, Sethianism specifically, is more on the mythological side of that. And I guess just to wrap up this talk, and again, I know this has been a bit of a speed bump lecture, right? We're all sort of racing to get to the Neo-Pythagoreans, or maybe to Alcinous, where we really get some really great, or Galen or something. But I know this is a bit of a speed bump lecture, but I feel like it's good to cover these guys. But at any rate, we have another character in this school named Severus. Severus, it's not clear. We don't know a lot about him, but we do know that his works were respected enough to be read among the Plotinus circle in Rome. So he was respected to be read by Plotinus. We know that he composed a De Anima, an On the Soul, and he composed a commentary on the Timaeus, and again seems to have been largely a stoicizing Platonist of some kind. He also is pretty radical in that he accepts the idea that creation did happen in time. So he is kind of a creation from nothing kind of interpreter of Plato, which is unusual. So he did have the idea of creation from nothing, although he thinks that the universe goes through cyclical periods of being done and undone. And so that makes him a bit more like a Stoic. He rejects the idea of the irrational soul. So he doesn't go down the route of the traditional rational, irrational soul. Rather, he accepts a more Stoic idea of the logos as the kritiki dunamis, the faculty of discernment, and he makes noesis, the organon, the instrument of that thing. So this is very Stoic in the way that he's thinking about the soul. And of course, he accepts the unitary nature of the soul over and against the Platonists, who accept at least a tripartite soul. He's following with Chrysippus and accepting a unitary nature of the soul. But he does say the soul is geometric in character. And so that sounds a lot like the old academy, someone like Chrysippus, and the idea of the geometric nature of the soul. So again, very stoicizing, but at the same time, pretty classically Platonic. So at any rate, just to wrap this section up, there's not a lot of unity of doctrine here. We're talking about philosophers who are in the same school, but there's not a great deal of unity of logic or unity of doctrine here. It's all over the place. You have it runs the gamut of peripatetic, Stoic, Platonist. It's all over the place. But at any rate, there is a sense of them being partisans of Plato. And this is a kind of, again, scholastic period where we see a lot of commentary literature and handbooks being produced. And so rather than there being great philosophy being done in this period, what we have is charismatic individuals like Taurus. We have largely a scholastic kind of literary output in the form of commentaries and a lot of polemics, right? Just a lot of polemical literature being written this time period, which I think is of inferior quality. So this school at Athens is not philosophically terribly rich, just to be very honest, in my opinion. However, as we transition to next time, we will get, I think, a much richer school of philosophy in what is called the philosophy of the school of Gaius. And the school of Gaius is going to produce some really luminary figures like Alcinous, who's going to produce perhaps the most important textbook on Platonism. He's going to produce Apuleius. Apuleius is a very important Platonic philosopher who has written the only novel that survives from ancient Rome, The Golden Ass. So that is a philosophical novel that gives us a lot of insight into Roman magic and the world of Roman literature, and Platonic ideas are deeply influenced into the Golden Ass. In fact, for a long time, many philosophers believed that the Asclepius associated with Hermes Trismegistus was in fact written by Apuleius. So Apuleius is really thought of as not just a Platonist, but also a kind of Hermeticist more generally. So Apuleius is also going to be the school of Gaius. And Galen, the very important Roman physician Galen, who writes some of the most important textbooks, is also going to be deeply infused with Platonic philosophy from the school of Gaius. So we turn next time to the school of Gaius and to the textbooks that get written during this time period, one of which does survive, and to the infusion of Platonism with some degree of magic and mystery in Apuleius's wonderful novel, The Golden Ass. So we will turn to the school of Gaius next, before turning finally to the Neo-Pythagoreans in a couple of weeks.